We got a new year, so we're bringing out a new playmat. I really love this playmat because very rarely do you ever see Yugi featured in anything. It's almost always the Pharaoh who ends up stealing the spotlight. But for this video, we're going to be talking about Pokemon versus Yu-Gi-Oh! And to specify that more and break it down into into an easier topic, we're going to be just looking at uh, the first edition base set versus the first edition LOB. And so, obviously, when you're talking about trading cards, the holos are always the highly sought after cards, and so for base set and LOB, those are the most sought after, most expensive, highest wanted cards, and also the most well known. So for both those sets, you've got these really well known holographic cards: the Blastoise, the Charizard, the Venusaurs, the Mewtwo's, and then the Blue Eyes White Dragons, the Dark Magicians, the Red Eyes Black Dragon, the Exodia. But then also, along with those cards, you have the lesser value but still very well known holographic cards like Hitmonchan, Mystic Elf, Celtic Guardian, and Magneton. Cards of that sort. And even though they are the lesser value holographic cards, just because they're holographic cards, they're still of greater value than the common cards, obviously, within these sets. And when you're talking about holographic cards between Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, what's really nice about Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh I should say, is that Yu-Gi-Oh cards have these different rarities within them. And so when you're talking about the values of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, using those rarities is really nice for establishing values for them. So Dark Magician is an ultra rare card. It's a higher rarity pool than Mystic Elf, which means there are less Dark Magicians, and it's harder to get a Dark Magician or pull a Dark Magician than it is a Mystic Elf. That adds to the value of Dark Magician as part of why Dark Magician is more valuable than Mystic Elf. But then also for Yu-Gi-Oh, when you're talking about values of cards, rarity isn't just the only thing that determines the value for Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Because Yu-Gi-Oh as a game, or as a franchise, I should say, is based so heavily on the trading card game, throughout the anime and the manga and whatnot, everything was always just based on the trading card game. So how good a card is and how playable it is within the trading card game is also a big deciding factor on what the value of the card can be. It's not always that big. Dark Magician is a terrible card. It's just not very playable. Still a very high value out of first edition LOB. But when you're talking about like Dark Hole and Mystic Elf, both of them are from the same set. Both of them are super rares. Mystic Elf obviously was in the anime a whole bunch. Yugi used it a bunch, and it was one of his main cards in his deck. Dark Hole very rarely got seen in the anime. Was maybe played like once or twice, I think. But Dark Hole is still by far more valuable than Mystic Elf, and that has a lot to do with the fact that since Dark Hole was released, it was a really good card, and still is today, and still is used in decks today. And so because Dark Hole is just used so much within decks and is such a good card, it helps make it a more valuable card and is a big reason why it is more valuable than Mystic Elf, even though Mystic Elf was one of Yugi's big cards and used in the anime a lot. And then when you're talking about Pokemon holographic cards, there are no different rarities for these holographic cards for Pokemon, not in base set anyway. Later on there are increased holographic rarities, but for base set, you have the same chance of pulling a Blastoise out of a pack of base set as you do a Hitmonchan. So what's determining the value on these cards isn't so much really how good they are, because the Pokemon franchise wasn't based around the TCG. It was based around the video games. And the video games had those first, 151 Pokemon, which are all the base set cards. And obviously the three starters, everybody used the three starters. You had to use one of the three starters whenever you played the game. So the three starter Pokemon are the most valuable holographic cards. The Charizard, the Blastoise, and the Venusaur. Those are the highest value cards out of base set. and that's because that's what collectors have deemed them to be. They have deemed them to be the most valuable. They're willing to pay the most for those cards, compared to like a card like Hitmonchan, where it's just not as popular or as well liked of a card. It doesn't matter so much which cards are good, because pretty much no cards out of base set are playable in the TCG right now, I'm pretty sure. Most of them are absolute trash. And that's because, like I said, Pokemon doesn't have its value based on, or the Pokemon cards don't have their value based on the TCG. They're more collector items. So because collectors say that they're willing to pay more for Blastoise than they are for Hitmonchan, that's why Blastoise is worth more than Hitmonchan, and because it's just so much more popular as well. But in the same token, when you're talking about rarity for Yu-Gi-Oh cards, rarity isn't the sole determining factor for Yu-Gi-Oh, the value of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So right here we have a Trihorn Dragon, and that's a secret rare, and a Dark Magician, that's an ultra rare. The Trihorn Dragon has a higher rarity, but is worth less than the Dark Magician, and that's because the Dark Magician is just a more popular, more sought after card. It was used in the anime a whole bunch. It's not as good as a card as Trihorn Dragon. Trihorn Dragon is a better card, but that doesn't matter because Trihorn Dragon wasn't used in the anime. It wasn't, the main character's card like Dark Magician was, and so because of that, Dark Magician is a more valuable card. And then when you're talking about base set and LOB, obviously the common cards are a big part of those sets. They make up most of the sets. And when you're comparing the common cards, the big advantage that Pokemon has is that the Pokemon cards in base set are all from the original 151 Pokemon, from the original games that were released in back in the 90s. And all those cards from base set are just incredibly recognizable because of that. They're highly iconic. They're cards that you could show to anybody who's a Pokemon fan, and they would probably be able to name off the card just by looking at the picture. So, I mean, just like an example, you could put your thumb over this name of, and you could just show this to anyone who knows anything about Pokemon, or even hardly knows anything about Pokemon, and they'll know that it's Pikachu. It's the face of the franchise. And then even with the next card, where this one, it's not a very well liked Pokemon. It's not a very good Pokemon at all. It doesn't have any evolution. But you show this to really most Pokemon fans, and because it's from the original 151, they're gonna know probably what it is and say it's Tangela. And then not even just the Pokemon cards, but also the trainer cards are really well known as well, because Pokedex was used in the anime a bunch. Ash used it a whole lot. You could show this again to any Pokemon fan, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's a Pokedex. I know what that is." They might not know what the card does, but they can look at the picture and know what it is. And the same thing just can't really be said for Legend of Blue Eyes. Maybe for a couple cards, here's an example where you could probably show this to a Yu-Gi-Oh fan, the picture of it, and they'll probably know that it is Beaver Warrior because Yu-Gi used it in the anime so much. But then for a lot of the other, Legend of Blue Eyes cards, like, cover up the name on this card, show it to any Yu-Gi-Oh player, any Yu-Gi-Oh fan, and I doubt most of them will be able to say the name. It's even hard to pronounce, And so here's another example, same thing. Have you ever seen this card? Ever seen it used? Ever seen anybody put in their deck? Probably not. Name's difficult to pronounce. Same thing. Have you ever seen this card used? I haven't. But, those are the LOB cards that are just vanilla mostly. I think there's a total of 3 effect monsters in LOB out of the 120 some cards that were printed in it. So that's the big advantage that Pokemon has as far as the base set versus the LOB, is that every card from base set is iconic because they are from the original 151 Pokemon, and even the trainers are based off of those video games that everybody played. So they're highly iconic, they're highly recognizable, and they're highly sought after because of that. Whereas Yu-Gi-Oh just doesn't have the same thing. You can't say the same thing about Yu-Gi-Oh. However, LOB does have a uniqueness to it because it has these sort of trash cards. Well, not sort of, they are trash cards, but you have these unique cards like these fusion cards where they're just incredibly weak for what they are. A 1000 attack monster for basically 3 cards to make this card. And you just never see these cards again. You'll never see cards, this weak again. These fusion cards that are basically unplayable. And very few of these cards actually got reprinted at all, except for later on LOB reprints, I guess, within like the Master Collection and Legendary Collection. And so I said LOB is pretty much a trash set. There's only really 4 good cards out of all of LOB, and that's Darkhole, Raigeki, Pot of Greed, and Monster Reborn. And 2 of those cards have been on the ban list for quite a while now. And to really solidify how bad LOB is, you have Skull Redbird, which is the highest 4-star attacking monster in Legend of Blue Eyes, with an attack of 1550, and which is a common card within the set. And then compare it to Metal Raiders, where it has 7-colored fish as a common card as a 4-star monster with 1800 attack. There's just no comparison. Like, 7-colored fish is by far the better card, hands down, no question about it. And then, even in Metal Raiders, it has a rare card that's got 2000 attack as a 4-star monster. And even with the effect of having to pay 1,000 life points to attack with it, it's still a far better card than Skull Redbird. So that just kind of really solidifies like how bad of a set Legend of Blue Eyes was. And those common cards within Legend of Blue Eyes just aren't that sought after. They're not recognizable, and they're not going to be very valuable because of that. You can look at collectors for Pokemon, where many Pokemon collectors have now or are working on or have already collected basically the entire base set first edition card, all 120 some or 10 some cards graded as PSA 10. And some of those common cards are going for ridiculous amounts. A PSA 10 first edition Growlithe, it's a trash card, doesn't matter, it's still selling for $500. And I just don't see, a card like Kumatoko graded as a PSA 10 selling for $500. I just don't see it. It's just not going to happen. So these Legend of Blue Eyes commons just don't stack up to the base set commons because they're not known as well. And so that's basically the whole rundown. I'm not going to give my whole opinion on which one is better or not. This video wasn't meant to be of which one is better, base set or LOB. It was just more of a comparison video. And as always, thank you for watching.